Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels. And on this week's episode, I have Alix Christie, and she is going to be talking about her new book, The Shining Mountains. Alix, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, DelSheree. My name's Alix Christie, and I'm a novelist and a short story writer and a journalist. So I started writing novels rather late in my career. It's a second career, and published my debut in 2014 called Gutenberg's Apprentice. I recently won the Missouri Review Fiction Contest, Editor's Prize Contest, so it's been really a fun experience, taking a long history of newspaper reporting and turning it into fiction.
It's exciting being able to come from one genre, move to another. How did you find that process to be for you?
Well, it's interesting. I started my career, both of them, as a young person. I wrote my very first novel when I was 10, and I also published my first newspaper when I was 10, the Christie Chronicle. So I've always had an interest in both. My mother was a journalist, so, I decided after college that I needed to have a job that would, pay for my rent. So I became a journalist for 30 years, but I always loved fiction and read a lot. And I started when I was, 40, had my first child, and I decided it was time to devote myself to that other love. And I went and got a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative and started writing fiction seriously.
How long did it take you to complete your first book, Gutenberg's Apprentice?
Like many writers, it was not the first. There was a really bad novel that's still in a drawer that was the first one that I started writing back in the late 90s sometime. So I worked on that one for a number of years. And then Gutenberg's Apprentice grew out of my interest and my hobby, which is printing, letterpress printing. My grandfather was a printer and a type founder. So it was one of those things that was sparked by something I read in the newspaper. And then over a number of years, I did the research. I think it took me from start to publication a total of 7 years, which is, a hugely long time for a novel. But as is true with this new novel too, my work seems to have an interest in looking at real life and real situations and real historical periods, really immersing myself in those periods and then imagining who the people were, who were real historical figures, why they acted the way they did and how lives were, and creating a fiction based on a kind of a factual scaffold. So this new book, too, took me 3.5 years, I would say, of research and writing. And then we had a pandemic, so it took a bit longer to get published. I think it was about 3 years for this one.
The process is getting faster. You got it in half this time.
Exactly. Or I focused more. I've also had a very busy life. My husband and I are both journalists. We've both been correspondents, and we have moved around quite a bit. So there's a few international moves in there, children to raise, life to live, income to earn, all those things. So, I think like many writers, we all have day jobs of one kind or another, except the very lucky few who can live off of it. This type of writing takes longer because there's a large research component.
Absolutely. That's something that, for me personally, has always scared me away from historical fiction. Just like, I don't have the time to put in the amount of research necessary to really do it right. And I think that's so important.
Are your novels set in a contemporary period more often?
For the most part, some of mine have like historical components, especially some of the ones set in the Southwest that deal with some of the Native American history. But overall, yeah, I'm more contemporary. I'm one of those that if I'm going to do something it's going to be done right when it comes to my writing. Like, I have got to put in all the research. At this point in my life, I don't have the time to do that much research for something historical.
Sure. It's but what I was saying, we all have constraints as writers, and so I have not produced many books, but they tend to be very deep dives. I'm happy to tell you all about the book, as we go forward, but very deep dive into subjects that I didn't know that much about in the beginning.
And that's something I could tell right off the bat with The Shining Mountains. I was really blown away by the detail and the realistic feel of it. Some of your descriptions, one of the ones that really stuck with me, the scene when Catherine gives birth the first time, and just the detail of that process and the cultural practices. And I was just like, wow, I wouldn't have known what that experience would have been like for her coming into this. I was really surprised by that and really impressed by how realistic and how complete that scene felt.
Well, thank you. I will say I have born children, so that helped have firsthand experience of what it's like to give birth. But, I think for me, what's wonderful about writing fiction is the imaginative act, of inhabiting another person. And I spend so much time with these characters. And frankly, these people were real people. Shining Mountains is the story of my great-great-grandfather's brother, Angus McDonald. He was a real person, and his wife, Catherine Baptiste, who came from the Nez Perce tribe, was a real person. And, they left traces in the archives, not much, certainly not for a woman and not in an oral tradition as much, but to me, they really were real people. And then the more time I spent with them imagining how they navigated this really complex world that they were living in, the more I felt that they were real, and I felt very close to them. And, as far as understanding the world, particularly that Catherine came from, I really relied hugely on just a vast wealth of literature, of oral histories, and of traditional tales from the Nez Perce and the Salish and Kootenai tribes, just to really try to feel what it was like. I think so much of creative writing for me anyway is about feeling, about kind of inching your way into the character and trying to imagine how it felt to be that person at that moment. Because I really think the one thing I love about fiction, and even historical or not, is it's about universal human values, and we are all so much more similar than we are different. And I think that's why I love writing characters from really different backgrounds. It makes me feel that we're all close and connected.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. I think for me, I'm very character driven when I write. And so that's something that's really important to me too, is making sure that those characters really come alive. Because I think when you, as the reader, connect with those characters, you start gaining a better understanding of their experience. And that is one of the cool things about fiction, is that you can experience things that are not going to happen in your everyday life, especially with historical fiction. What was that like to live out in this wild country and have these competing forces? Like, that's not something most of us in today's world are ever going to experience firsthand.
Exactly. And that was a learning process for me throughout the research of the novel, because I really started out just being interested in these people. But as I understood better their predicament, and how they found themselves caught in these clashing worlds, which were really violent too, I began to understand that we do today in 2023 need to understand what really happened in the history of this country. And I've been writing some essays about the book, and one of the things I always say is I wasn't taught this in school. No one taught us the history of the indigenous people of this country. And it's starting a little bit, but that's one really great thing that fiction can do, is really put the reader in the place and say, it wasn't abstract. It wasn't like, oh, they just grabbed the land and put people on reservations. It was very specific and very carefully done. And here's exactly how they did it. And I think there's an educational component that kind of came out of the book for me, that wasn't in my mind to begin with. I was reading about the lives of Angus and Catherine and beginning to understand where they lived at each time, because the book is factually accurate in terms of where they were posted, how many kids they had, where they lived. Angus left enough detail in his letters and in his archives, and the Hudson Bay Company, for whom he was a fur trader, is very deeply researched and documented. So for me, it was really about what was it like to be caught in that crossfire of settler colonialists coming from the East, and this world that they'd, had to make compromises around, but worked for them, was suddenly going to be destroyed. And I just, for me, became a really important political statement too, that we need to understand this history if we as a nation are going to heal from the past. And I think there's a lot of people who agree with that idea.
Yeah, having grown up here in the Southwest, right near the Navajo Reservation, and we have several different reservations in this area, I didn't learn most of that history in school either. Learning about it as an adult, taking history classes in college and just being more aware of it, and as it's talked about more, and especially with my kids going through school, there's a lot of it that I'm like, wow, I had no idea about a lot of the history and what brought on some of these events and how they came to be and what that timeline was. And it's been really eye-opening to learn more about that, especially since I took over doing Right on Four Corners. I've had the opportunity to read a lot more books about this area and talk with authors. And it's been really illuminating, and it's given me more appreciation for this area and how we got to where we are today.
Exactly. And I think stories are such a powerful tool for that. Everyone knows that. We have so much film and television, but also novels, that are not, history, reading history as a historian is very different than experiencing something as a story. And I think for most people, it's easier to enter into a story than to sit down with a factual documented history. And hopefully, if people become interested, then they would go deeper into the documentation, but it's a way for us to, as we were saying earlier, make it alive, make it real. And I feel like I never really thought I would write historical fiction, but I think because I'm a journalist, I'm really interested in reality and the past. I just happen to be interested in each of the two subjects I've written novels on because of my family connections. There were family reasons to do those books. But I feel as though the history is always just beneath the surface. We can understand today so much better if we know where we came from. And when I'm driving around the West, I grew up in the West. I lived in British Columbia. I lived in Montana. I lived in California. And I've driven all through this area that Catherine and Angus lived in 180 years ago. And it feels very different to me now. It feels very rich and deep and layered. I know who lived there before. I know some of the stories. I know why things are named the way they are. And to me, it's very enriching too. It's fun actually to know the past of places that you live.
It is. I think it brings it to a more personal level, being someone living or even just traveling through that area, to understand this is an area that has its own history that's been changing and developing over time with and without human intervention. It does. As a place, it has its own story.
Right. And as we're learning through a lot of indigenous wisdom that is now finally being, respected by the broader culture, the Native people have maintained and managed and cared for this landscape for millennia and have a lot to teach us. So I think I'm really encouraged. I did quite a bit of consultation with both of the tribes that I wrote about, and I've been watching as a journalist and trying to write more about Indigenous things for the work I do for The Economist. And it's really incredible to see all of the efforts to restore the salmon runs, to bring the condors back. And a lot of these projects are being initiated by Indigenous people who lived on these landscapes for generations. So I think we're in a really exciting moment, actually. And hopefully books like mine and others, that I think about the books by Louise Erdrich, which I really admire, which really show us what it's like to live in the world of the Native American reservation on and off, and many stories are coming out that have not been found their place and have not been allowed out, really, in the publishing industry. And it's exciting. It's an exciting time, I think.
It is, bringing those voices out that, like you said, didn't necessarily have a place open to them previously.
Right.
And there is much more of a focus on having a diversity of voices and letting people experience more than just their own culture. And seeing how other people within our own country or throughout the world, that, how other people experience life and how one thing affects everybody so differently depending on who they are and where they are and how they have lived and grown.
Exactly. And that's where fiction and literature, I think, are sort of unparalleled portals, into other people's experience. And I was just reading an article in the New Yorker about the decline of the English major, and it's worrisome, because I think stories, I am definitely not the first writer to say it, stories are how we understand how we live, and we need people to continue to understand the value of literature, I think.
Absolutely. And something I wanted to ask you about, you brought up a little bit, the concept of sensitivity readers, I think, is fairly new-ish. It's something
Yeah.
that has become more of a practice, which is good, and something that I think as a whole, the publishing industry is trying to be a little bit more aware, more sensitive, and making sure they're getting things right when it is, especially someone from outside of a culture writing about a culture. And it sounds like you put a lot of time into working with descendants of some of the tribes that are discussed in the book to make sure things are accurate and represented appropriately. Tell me more about that process.
Sure. No, I was very fortunate in that I am related by marriage to the mixed race family that descended from this Scottish fur trader and his Nez Perce wife. She was Nez Perce and French, because her father was French and Mohawk, actually. So she herself was mixed race, Catherine Baptiste. But there's an entire 5 generations later, there's a giant community of McDonald descendants who live mostly on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, north of Missoula. And when I first was interested in writing about them, I went and I met really the clan elder, the tribal elder, Joe McDonald, who had founded, he's a longtime teacher, and he was a principal of the high school, and he founded the Salish Kootenai College in 1977. So he's a really key person in the community. And he was so welcoming and friendly and helpful. And, I realized that their family is just as interested in the Scottish side of the family that they didn't know that much about, so I was able to help them with some information about our common ancestors who came from the Highlands of Scotland. And through that family connection, I really felt very supported. They, not only Joe, but a number of my cousins really, approved of the project and supported it. And they gave me a lot of good and clear advice about consultation. And I was aware from really the very first minute that if I, as a white woman, am going to write about a Native American woman and her family and her tribe, I need to do that consultation. And I didn't need to have my publisher get a sensitivity reader, because instead I went through a process of consultation formally with both tribes. And each tribe now, I don't know if this is true across the country, I guess maybe each tribe has a cultural committee who is tasked in the tribe with dealing with requests for research on the reservation and archaeology and things like that. And their job is to protect their tribal culture. And so I went to each of the 2 tribes, the Nez Perce and the Salish Kootenai Confederated Tribes, and formally petitioned to be able to do the project. And it was heard in the committee, and I got approval from both of them to do that. But that was sort of just the paperwork part in a way, the formal part. And then in each tribe, I found an elder of the tribe. One of them in Montana, she was actually a descendant of Angus and Catherine, and she read the manuscript and she approved it. And then in Idaho, a former tribal chairman also read it, and I met with him and he made some suggestions. So, it was absolutely vital, I think, that we don't limit what we write about, but we write about it with accuracy, sensitivity, do our very best to not make mistakes, understand our own biases. It's hard, but I think that fiction has to have the ability to imagine other worlds and other lives, but we have to do it responsibly, and so that was part of the length of the process, was just doing the consultation. But it also gave me time to learn about the cultures and to read deeply and to read, Nez Perce traditional tales. And a lot has been published. There's a great deal out in the public domain that you can learn, and you can do your homework as a writer. I think it's really critical that you do that.
I think so as well, especially when it comes to culture and belief. I think there's kind of that phrase or concept of, writers know a little bit of everything and kind of masters of nothing. We kind of tend to research up to the point. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And I think, that works in some ways. You can't necessarily become an expert on everything every time you write a
No.
book, but I think with writing about a different culture that maybe you are not a part of, and sometimes even if you are, to understand more deeply, because not everybody lives in a traditional way within their culture. But I think it is really important to take that time to put in that effort to make sure it's done right, and that respect for what you're writing about is there. Because unfortunately, we live in a time where people see something, they read something, and take it as fact too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's important in your responsibility as a writer, I think, to not contribute to misinformation or misrepresentation in what you're
Right.
doing.
Exactly. Well, there's quite a big conflict or controversy right now about, truth in fiction and truth particularly in TV miniseries, and the New York Times just wrote a big piece about this. And unfortunately, true or not, viewers and readers tend to believe what they read and think that it's the historical truth. And so if you're writing about history, I think, you have this huge obligation to get it right, because people will think that what you're writing is true. And so, I have, for the first time on this book, I actually have acknowledgments and sources at the end, and I try to show, which parts really are documented. On a larger scale, I really used historical events pretty much as they occurred, try to build their story around these different conflicts, wars. There were the so-called Indian Wars in the mid-19th century, as westward expansion happened, as people came on the Oregon Trail. The U.S. government and military were under pressure from the settlers to, quote, deal with the native people who were there. And so all of the things that I put in the book occurred as I wrote them, because I think, why would you make something up unless, you had to for some plot reason? But what I realized is that, the truth is very dramatic. What happened was plenty dramatic. I don't have to invent plot twists. And as you said, if you're writing a character-driven story, I'm really interested in just these two people and it's a love story. You wouldn't think, listening to our conversation, that my novel is, but it's a love story of these two people who, from different worlds, created this amazing family that weathered tremendous conflict and difficulty, and their survivors are very wonderful, engaged members of the world today, and they made it through. And so I just think there's plenty of drama in reality.
You think of that phrase, truth is stranger than fiction, and I think that is all too often true. I was just talking to someone recently who made the comment talking about their life story, and like, people tell me I should write a book, but no one would believe it was true.
Oh, maybe. I mean, think of the crop of memoirs,
Mm-hmm.
people do live most the darndest things, right?
They do.
And I'm lucky to have been a journalist for many years, and I worked in local newspapers, and I worked as a foreign correspondent, and I've seen a lot of how people are, and it's crazy. There's a million stories. They always say that, the million stories in the naked city, and it's true. People's lives are incredibly different and varied and interesting.
They are. Yeah, I recently just went back to journalism, and I'm lucky in that I'm a community editor, so I get to work more in kind of the more positive and uplifting side of journalism for the most part, and getting to meet community leaders who are doing interesting things and exciting new developments, and working with community members to become freelancers, because it's a fairly small town. It's hard to get full-time journalists here.
Sure.
So we're working on developing a lot of community members to write for us and help tell the story of this area and what people are doing. And being able to, I was working with one recently, and he was kind of like, I've never done this. He comes from a different writing background. And after we kind of went over what some of these profiles of community members should look like and how to approach it, and he was like, oh, I'm basically still telling a story. Like, yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the reasons that we're in the pickle that we're in the country, in terms of not understanding one another, is that local news has been really dismantled. And I started in local newspapers, and I wrote about community people. I had a column. I wrote mainly profiles of people. People need to see themselves in their community newspaper, and it gives them a sense of cohesiveness and belonging and being part of the same and it's a really, and, positive stories like who won the 4-H contest, and all these things are really critical, I think. And because of the way the business is consolidated and everything, they've just been falling droves, and I do think that there's an awareness now of how important that is as a glue in communities. And really, a lot of people are trying to reinvent local journalism online and things. And I'm all in favor of that. I think that that's what we need to keep ourselves, to find ourselves that our neighbors are ours. And even if we don't agree, we're all part of the same community.
Yeah, you're after the same goal, which is, keeping your community growing and in a positive direction and working together. And I think that is a really cool aspect of it, and hopefully continue to kind of see some resurgence in that in a lot of smaller places, especially.
Well, and I think about it, coming back to the book, I think about Angus a lot because he was someone who was very well educated. The Scots of his day were very well educated, and then he ended up in a very different world, but he was always trying to understand all sides. And he actually, part of the reason I started writing the novel was that my brother, who's a historian and a professor, he found these newspaper articles that Duncan McDonald published in the 1870s, which was remarkable, that a newspaper asked a native person to describe what was the flight of the Nez Perce from the native point of view. So they were journalists and trying to understand from both sides. I don't think that Angus, he tried to live in both worlds. They all had to live in both worlds, even their descendants. There's sort of no point in demonizing the other side. You have to work it out. You have to find a way forward. And so those characters, in a way, had that same approach because they were in a time of huge conflict and they wanted to survive.
Exactly. I think that dual perspective is so important, especially in today's world. And something I've noticed, because this book is published through UNM Press, and I've noticed that with their spring catalog that they sent out of new and upcoming books, that seems to be a focus of giving a wider view to history, to current issues, to what's going on, and just letting people see a little bit beyond their own experience.
I have been so impressed by the press. My book was published by a big New York publisher, and this is a wonderful university press. I think one of the oldest in the country, very highly regarded. And yeah, I think they're doing super work. And as you say, it's really a very broad palette. From local history and natural history to poetry to the High Road Books imprint with their commercial fiction. They're reaching high and wide, and I have nothing but praise for their catalog. I think it's really interesting too.
Well, it sounds like then you've had a good experience going through that publishing process with them.
Absolutely. No, and I don't know if you maybe seen the final copy of the book. It's just coming out now. It's been printed, and it's being shipped. And the book is beautiful. The entire process has been really wonderful. Once we had once the manuscript was purchased, what's different about University Press, and I appreciate it, especially for this book, they have a vetting process. They don't just buy a book and publish it. They buy a book and then they share it with a faculty committee. And faculty committee is going to base their approval or disapproval on external readers. So it's a kind of peer review process. It's sent to 3 different readers outside of New Mexico, two of whom were not. And I got feedback from these external readers. So it felt like a very serious process and very thorough. And I appreciated that, actually, because it is delicate for me to be writing into this community, especially now when people are rightly saying, well, people should be allowed to speak in their own voice. And as I said, I have this huge family in Montana now, and they're wonderful. One of my cousins by marriage is a filmmaker, and I've known her at the beginning. I would have loved to cooperate with one of my cousins in the ideal authorial situation, but they supported me in writing the book. So I feel confident that as good a job as I could. Culturally, anyway.
Where can people find the book once I know it's available for pre-order now, but where can people go to find the book and to follow you?
Wonderful, thank you. Well, it is coming into bookstores as we speak, so you can go into your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it. You can go online. I like bookshop.org, but you can get it, at Barnes & Noble, at Amazon, at any major bookstore will have it now. It's called The Shining Mountains. And my website is alixchristie.com, ALIXCHRISTIE.
We are just about out of time, but I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your book with me and for taking the time to come on the radio show.
DelSheree, it has really been fun talking with you. I appreciate it.
Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.